The idea of an X-Men #1 to relaunch the series is one of those ideas that had like many mothers or many fathers. In the 90s, there was real excitement in really heavily rendered artwork. It was a time of transition for comics because we were moving off of the newsprint paper and the sort of type of coloring that we'd done since the inception of comics in the 1940s to new methods of printing comics using computerized color for the first time. Visually, fans were responding to comics that were much more graphically exciting than what they'd seen in the past. And when you're doing that kind of involved artwork, that kind of big production value, you need stories that really sort of speak to those kind of strengths.
X-Men #1, the Jim Lee Claremont X-Men, for me and people in my generation, I feel like that's a really big moment that we own. There was hysteria around it and everybody you know was buying it. I was right at the age, I was a kid and I was buying it in a comic shop new. It felt huge and important, but it was my huge and important. I wasn't going back and finding out what other people already knew.
The fact that it was a #1 that you could jump on, brand new #1, brand new storyline, top of the line creators, and that I think is what made it resonate.
X-Men was, at that point, Marvel's top franchise, was more popular than Spider-Man, more popular than the Avengers. It was all about the comic books at that point, and we were selling really terrific numbers.
By the time X-Men #1 came along, we had been the best-selling comic at Marvel, except when Frank Miller was doing Daredevil and we were dueling it out. We'd been #1 for over a decade.
Todd McFarlane, of course, had come out with Spider-Man #1 the year before. It had been a tremendous sales success for Marvel. Up to that point, it was the best-selling comic book in modern comics history. Of course, it seemed natural that there would be some sort of X #1. Creatively, then the challenge fell to Bob Harras, their editor, and to Jim and to Chris. Why relaunch the franchise? And that's where Bob came up with the whole sort of X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold concept. There were so many X-Men right now that you needed more than one X book. Using this as an opportunity to help new readers come on board the X-Men franchise and sort of understand what at that point had become a very, very complicated backstory. This was really being set up as the first of the great 1990s X-Men stories.
For me, it was a matter of we're on an upward curve. What ways can we find that will allow us to continue that upward curve and perhaps make it steeper and more exciting?
Chris Claremont is basically the godfather of the X-Men. He didn't actually create the characters, but is probably the person responsible for telling more X-Men stories than anybody around. The whole popularity of the modern X-Men is down to Chris and his in-depth storytelling and characterization.
Chris is my inspiration in terms of how do you keep it fresh for that long? It was as good in the X-Men as it ever was. I don't know how you make that work. And I think part of how you make it work is you're working with a powerhouse like Jim Lee.
Jim Lee was a young comic book artist who was brought into Marvel by an editor named Carl Potts and really sort of made a mark for himself very, very quickly. Jim also has an interesting background in that he studied pre-med at Princeton, so he had one of the strongest senses of how the human body works. His sense of anatomy created like a dynamism to his style.
Jim Lee's interpretations of the X-Men characters is classic, awesome. It's the visual reference for everyone drawing the X-books, even today. Scott Williams enhanced his work beautifully. They really were an unbeatable team together.
Jim was doing things on the page that no one else was doing. We take some of this for granted now. We take the layouts, we take the art style very much for granted because he was so influential.
Is there any better double page splash than Magneto, high above Earth, not even worrying about oxygen?
It was such an exciting looking book. That cover is so iconic and so beautiful.
We had really started to do what we were calling at the time enhanced covers, which were very popular at that time. I worked on a lot of those. I think everybody was expecting us to do something like that for the X-Men.
It had multiple covers, which was crazy at the time. We were like, wait, what? And then there's a cover that folds out. That was the coolest thing we'd ever seen.
Todd's Spider-Man had sold 3 million copies, and we'd done 2 versions of that when it first came out. Ultimately, X-Men #1 ended up selling 8 million copies, which was something that blew us all away.
And after X-Men 1, we were scoring sales numbers that nobody had seen in the modern era. Who knows where we could go from there?
All of a sudden, some of the kids that had not been comic fans were like, oh, I want to go try and get this X-Men #1 that I heard about. Welcome aboard, bandwagoneers.
X-Men #1 is a good example of Claremont being able to kind of change with the times. He had so many different eras of his X-Men run. It still feels like one big run, one big story that he's telling, and subplots that go on and on for years.
For any comic book to have a situation where readers would queue up at the entrance to the comic book store on the third Thursday of every month to get the latest issue, from a creator standpoint, that is a goldmine. That is like, holy cow, what have we done? And how can we do it again and again and again?
X-Men #1 is a book that stands the test of time. It's a great love letter from Chris to the franchise and to these characters he spent so much time with. It's Jim at the top of his game, so the excitement that he had really translates to the page. It's really a very pure expression of comic storytelling. That's what makes me very happy that that book exists and makes me proud to be associated with it.